Thomas. So Sarah is a rural housing enabler for Grŵp Cynefin, and Sarah covers the Gwynedd County in North Wales. Sarah is also a community-led housing advisor, so she knows lots about housing and working with communities, and has many years experience of working in community development as well. So I think to get a picture of housing in rural communities in Wales, I think I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and thank you very much.
Hi, thanks Casey. Good morning everyone. This is the first time I've done a presentation online, so you'll have to bear with me maybe at times. I've been working online obviously, but not made an actual presentation. So yeah, so I'm Sarah Ashton Thomas, and I'm the Rural Housing Enabler for North West Wales. There's 4 of us all together, there's a whole team, and so we work in the counties of Gwynedd, Conwy and Anglesey. And what is a rural housing enabler, you might ask? So it's somebody who helps identify the need for rural housing and then works to try and provide solutions to that need. Obviously, a rural housing enabler can't work alone in doing that. So we work with partners to try and meet that need, or so we work for the Rural Housing Enabler Partnership, which is a partnership between the housing associations in North West Wales, the local authorities and the National Park. And the way we work predominantly at the moment is to carry out a housing needs survey in a particular area and analyse the data for that area. More often than not at the request of a partner at the moment, and it might be a partner, a housing association partner that's got an eye on a piece of land and needs to know, is there a need there to develop houses or homes, or it might be, for example, the National Park has identified some land that in their local development plan for development, and again wants to see if there's any need. If there's a need there and what sort of need is there, and that can then be put in front of the various housing associations to see if they're in a place to develop homes there. So that's how we work at the moment. In a second, I'm going to go through some of the challenges with that way of working, and in that sort of looking at why it's so important that we rural housing need, and then in doing that maybe looking at some of the solutions to that and ways that we could sort of move things forward, if you like, and do a better job, if you like, of enabling housing in rural areas. So it's worth mentioning as well that when we're talking about affordable housing, obviously the first thing that springs to mind is social housing. But as many of you may well know, there are more options available these days than just social housing. So there's, for example, there are rent to buy schemes, there's part ownership models, buying at a lower price, but there's conditions on resale. There's a scheme called Self-Build in Self-Build Wales. I've noticed Arfon is here. I'm sure Arfon can tell us a bit more about that later as well. And also there's more efforts now to look at empty properties. So for example, I know that Grŵp Cynefin, one of the housing associations up here, managed to work with the council to bring one of their old properties that wasn't going to come up to Welsh housing quality standards and they would be unable to rent out, but they'd managed to work with somebody in the community and sell that to that individual, but who then received a grant from the council so that they could do that house up so that it, you know, that they could live in it. So there are more options these days than there used to be, you know, which is a good thing. And in North West Wales, Tai Teg is, which is also, sorry, I should have said, we work for the North West Wales Rural Housing Enabler Partnership, but we're sort of hosted, if you like, by Grŵp Cynefin, which is a housing association, and Tai Teg is also hosted by Grŵp Cynefin, working with individuals and social housing, affordable housing providers to try and meet that need. But as I said, there are challenges to the way that we work. One of the challenges, of course, is that it is identifying the need in the first place. So one is to actually, when we're carrying out our housing needs surveys, is to get to everyone who needs to fill in that survey, if you like. And even if we do get to them and get that information to them, is to engage them enough so that they do actually give that information back. And of course, you know, as we know, communities are they're diverse, aren't they? And there are different challenges in reaching different parts of the community. But also there's challenges when we're looking at the data. So the data that we might get, for example, are the number of people on the social housing register, for example, and that's used as a piece of evidence, if you like, to show housing need. But the data that you need to prove doesn't always correspond to what the planning authority is asking for. So, for example, if a housing association were to try and develop some houses in a particular village, if that the village might have a condition on it that in the local development plan, that the need that needs to be proven is that sort of that village and the rural area surrounding it, say for example to 6 kilometres around that the rural area around it, but that rural area might fall within several different community council areas, so it's very difficult then to kind of drill down into that data to get the information that you need to sort of prove that need, if you like. And you know, as you know, probably generally speaking, in rural areas, planning restrictions and what you need to prove is an awful lot more, isn't it, than in urban areas often. So that can be quite difficult. And then even if you do prove a need in rural areas, obviously that need is often quite small, big for the village maybe, but actually quite small in terms of developing houses. So even if there is a desire by the housing association to develop some homes in that village, for example, in that community, because the development, the need there is quite small, it's very difficult to make everything stack up financially, because of economies of scale, of course. And then also, even if you can make it add up financially, because you're working with quite small numbers, in a way, there's sort of a high risk that even if one or two people sort of manage to find their own solutions and don't need those homes anymore, that would have a sort of massive impact on your need, if you like, which isn't such a problem in an urban area with more people, because, you know, even if somebody finds a solution, well, there'll be somebody else who needs a home, won't there? But that's not always the case, obviously, in rural areas. And of course, over time, needs change, don't they? So it might be, you know, this year that the village needs home for young people. The community needs homes for young people, but in 5 years' time, that might be completely different, and it might be the older end of the population that needs somewhere to downsize to, or whatever. And again, because you're working with small numbers, that sort of has a big impact on what needs to be there, really. And also, of course, the context can change, can't it? You know, the village or the community might suddenly become far more desirable to visitors, and that can be good for the economy on one hand, but obviously that can be really difficult on the other hand, because, you know, house prices will increase, and so on. And in some places, really sadly, really, almost you can't prove the need because the need has already left. I was working in a community not long ago, and the people there were saying, oh, if only you could have come 10 years ago, you know, when all our children needed homes, but they've all had to move out and they've settled somewhere else now, had their children somewhere else, those children are settled and so on. And so the need isn't there anymore, but that in the sense that, okay, there aren't young people, for example, that need homes in that area, but that doesn't mean that that community doesn't need young people, if you like. So yeah, so it's not easy is the general message. But that's not to say that it's impossible. So the consequence of these challenges really is that even though we do enable rural housing, and that's great, it's a really important job that we do, generally speaking, nowhere near enough rural housing is developed, and this is across Wales, this isn't just, is developed to meet the need that's there. So just to look quickly at why it's important to develop local housing need, and I'm going to try, and hopefully this will work, to share my screen with you. Can everyone see that? Can you see my screen? Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm not going to try and get it up as a... Can everyone see the whole slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. I'm not going to try and get it up as a proper slide in a slideshow because it'll go wrong. As long as everyone can see what's there. Yeah, why housing is so important to the sustainability and resilience of communities. And really, the way to look at this, and to look at anything really when we're looking at communities, is to sort of see communities as a sort of spider's web, if you like, of connections between all the different elements within that community. So obviously this is a hugely simplified version just to sort of make the point. So if you sort of look at that spider web there, for example, in a community, you've got, the village shop, you might have a darts team, you might have a butcher, you might have a football team, the local bus service, the farmer. Sorry, I'm just going to move you because I can't see the... Oh yeah, and the local pub. That was the other thing. So that's just a quick example, isn't it? But there are connections between all those different elements within the community, and if one element disappears, then the connections between that element and the other elements also fall down, which then makes the position of the other the other elements within the community weaker, if you like. So a sort of sustainable and resilient community is going to be one where there are lots of those connections between the different elements within the community. And as one or two of those things drop away and those connections become weaker, or there are less of them, the community, one, becomes less sustainable, but also it becomes less resilient, so less able to deal with shock. And of course, looking towards the future, there are going to be great shocks to our community. We've already had one, haven't we? For example, with COVID, haven't we? But when you look at climate change and so on, there are going to be more waves, if you like, of shocks coming our way and hitting our communities. So where housing obviously plays a really important role in all of this is that it houses the people that creates those connections, doesn't it? So for example, if you don't have the housing that young families need, for example, in the community, there's going to be less children in the school. That gets to a point where all shuts. Then the families that were left there might go to a different school, so they'll then join a different football club. Their kids will join the football club that's nearest. Sorry, I've spelled football wrong, I've just realised. Anyway, the football club in the next village or whatever. That means that the football club for their after game sort of food, if you like, doesn't order their burgers from the local butcher, who then doesn't buy their meat from the local farmer, and so on. So that's one, but also it's not just about young families. And it's not just about the amount of housing, but it's how appropriate that housing is. So often in the rural communities, we've got, damp properties, we've got quite small properties, but sometimes inappropriately large properties as well, and so on, which are often difficult to renovate. So for example, if you had somebody older who was living in a house that was far too large for them, really difficult to heat, they spend all their spare cash on trying to keep warm. They don't have any spare cash, so they don't go down to the pub to play darts because they can't afford the pints. The darts team suddenly doesn't have enough members, which means, you know, they don't drink in the pub anymore. All of a sudden the pub has less customers, and so on. You know, you get the picture. So as with all of these elements, you know, housing is an integral part of that spider web, and it's not just the amount of housing, it's the type of housing, and the housing is appropriate for all the different ages and stages of people within that community. And that's true for any community, obviously, you know, urban and rural, but it's even more, I suppose, rural communities, because of the small numbers and the fact that they're far away from places, means that they're even more on a knife edge, if you like, than some urban communities. Although, of course, some urban communities also, because of for different reasons, will be on a knife edge too. Yeah, so I'll just, how do I stop sharing my screen? Hang on, there we go. I think, can everyone see me again?
Great.
Brilliant, yeah. Okay, so yeah, so housing is part of that, part of that fabric, isn't it? And so I'll just have a quick look now at why isn't there the housing to meet the local needs in the first place. Partly, obviously, lots of our rural communities were built a long time ago, and lots of the housing there, as I was saying, isn't necessarily fit for purpose anymore. Sort of built for a different age, if you like. So there's that, but also, like I've already mentioned, there's an emphasis within planning across Wales and the UK on developing within what they call sort of sustainable communities. So that those will tend to be, you know, your larger communities, maybe a sort of the main town or whatever within that area, and less within the smaller villages. And also, of course, because of landscape value, etc., in rural areas. So, you know, for those reasons, it's not easy to build in rural areas. But it's quite interesting looking at that planning policy and thinking about some of the challenges that we're facing now and in the future. For example, COVID has brought this into sharp relief, hasn't it? With people sort of living in cities or large towns or whatever, wanting to be able to escape to the countryside, and that house sales in rural areas have shot up because people are seeing, actually, we need the space, we need a local community where we've got, you know, we can have support and so on. But also, interestingly, I don't know if anyone's read this book. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth. It's not a cheery read, but by David Wallace Wells, and it's fascinating. So it's looking at the looking at climate change, really, and what that is bringing. And when you read that, and looking at even just within the next 50 years, the sort of impacts of that. One, of course, with, you know, low level flooding and so on, but also just from heat stress and the heat stress within cities. And what he's saying in there, actually, at the moment, you know, obviously the pattern is for people to move to cities, but actually over the next 50 years, the pattern may be, well, probably will be, people moving away from urban areas and out into the countryside. And in a way, it's almost as if the planning policy hasn't sort of quite caught up with that yet, and will probably need to. So that's quite, you know, that's quite interesting. And then, of course, this is in the news at the moment, is we've got the pressure from external sources. So, for example, second homes, Airbnbs, which means that there's less housing available and rising prices. So just to give you an example with some of the communities that we work with, for example, I've been working in a place called Glasinfryn, which is in Gwynedd, not that far from Bangor in North Wales. So the average income is 34,000. The lowest quartile income is 20,000, average is 20,000. But the income needed to enter the housing market at an entry level price is 45,000. So very few people are anywhere near that, and as a consequence, 65% of the population are priced out of the housing market, and that is true for well, every single community I've worked with so far. the percentages of people priced out of the housing market have been between 60 and 65%, which is huge, isn't it? So, and then the other thing as well is the impact on house prices, but also of houses being available in the first place. So in Gwynedd, for example, so between March 2019 and April 2020, 40% of the properties that were sold as second homes. And I think in Gwynedd, the local development plan identifies that 811 houses are needed in Gwynedd to be developed in Gwynedd each year to meet local demand, but 830 are lost as second homes each year. So actually, there's a shortfall of 1,600 houses a year within Gwynedd, which is huge, isn't it? You know, and those are people, aren't they? Those are families. That's 1,600 families in essence that you know, that aren't able to get the homes that they need. So, and in a way, Airbnb or that kind of thing has opened up a whole new market for people who couldn't afford second homes previously, to just have a second home for them to come to sometimes. But now, because it's really easy to let your second home out and you can make an income to sort of offset that, it's opened up, it's made it more affordable really for people who weren't necessarily sort of rich, if you like, but just had you know, who have some spare income, that they're able to sort of balance that. And I'm not saying that, you know, Airbnb shouldn't exist. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any form of holiday lets or anything like that in rural areas. You know, that can be a good way of boosting the economy. But in a way, what's happened is it's almost like the Wild West, isn't it? And the regulations haven't caught up with the technology, essentially. So I know, and especially since COVID, and obviously even more people trying to buy second homes, I know it's sort of been bumped up the agenda, hasn't it? And I know that people are talking now about changing planning law, so that you need to apply for planning permission to change a home from a permanent home into a second home or a holiday let, and also looking at caps on the percentage of homes that can be a second home within a community. So, and also one thing just to say, sorry, I'm going to go on to the solutions in one second, but also that obviously affects the rental market as well, because often people, even local people landlords who would be renting their homes out to local people normally, can make far more money renting them out as Airbnbs, and so that's a difficulty as well. Yeah, so essentially we need more help and support for local communities and individuals to be able to buy, renovate, use buildings in areas as homes that are sort of fit for modern family life, as it were. And sorry, I'll just go on. So in a way, to look at the solutions, I think we need to go in 3 different directions. Well, but although all 3 different directions are linked as well. So I think we need to look at the strategic and policy level, planning policy, and also the regulations, you know, around Airbnb, second home ownership, and so on. I think also then at a sort of county, regional, and national level, I think we need more joined up thinking and working to make sure that when one, prove the need, and then that we can meet the need, and that more joined up, you know, that's a perfect example, isn't it, when we talk about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. That's a perfect example where that could bring much better outcomes for people and for, you know, and for communities. But also, coming on to community-led housing, I think at a local level, I really do think that community-led housing could, and I'm not saying this would work in every community, but I think there are a great number of communities that community-led housing can overcome lots of the challenges that housing associations have in being unable to develop in rural areas because of the small numbers. And I think if there were some funding mechanism that would make it easier to develop community-led housing within Wales. I know from my experience of working with many communities over the years, there is the capacity within a lot of communities, and an increasing capacity, to take on that, you know, that responsibility of being able to develop their own homes in one way or another. Like you say, Casey, whether that's through a community land trust, or whether it's through a housing cooperative, or some other combination of things, and of course working in partnership with housing associations as well. So in a way, I think community-led housing, it almost feels a little bit like it's made for rural areas, if you like, although I know it's made for urban areas as well. But I think being able to work at that small scale, and with that the information that communities have at the community level to meet that need is there. That's there. I really do think there's, you know, we could go somewhere with that, as it were. So there you go. So I hope that was yeah, useful and informative. Yeah, I'm sure we've got questions and stuff afterwards, haven't we, in discussion and so on.
Yeah.
Diolch.
Thanks, Sarah. Diolch. That was a really good insight into the work that you do as rural housing enablers, and some of the issues facing our rural communities as well, in terms of the housing problems that they face in these communities, and some really shocking stats, I think, that you shared there, which is a bit crazy. And yeah, we'll definitely come on to questions and comments in the question and answer session towards the end. So thank you, Diolch. So now moving on from housing to transport, actually. And we've got Lisa Dennison here from the Heart of Wales Line Development Company. So Lisa is the development manager for the Heart of Wales Line, which is an accredited community rail partnership promoting and developing the Heart of Wales railway line for the benefit of people living and working locally, local businesses, and of course visitors to the different communities. So yeah, Lisa's going to give us an overview of the work that they do and the work that they do to regenerate these communities as well. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to start with, I'm going to do a bit of screen sharing as well. Yeah, that looks good. Everything's up. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. And I was surprised to be invited in a way, because I knew this was community-led housing, and there is a slight connection there, because my background is community-led housing, funnily enough, and I've been in the world of trains for just over a year, and it might seem like a strange jump to go from social housing and affordable housing that I was working in before to transport, and it has felt like quite a strange transition, but in a way the big thing in common is that I've always worked in communities, and you know, my background is community work, really. But yeah, it's been a steep learning curve, and you know, so thanks for the invite, and hopefully by the end of the session it'll become a bit clearer, maybe, hopefully, why I was chosen to be on the panel. Interestingly, I saw on the list of people here Wild Horizons, so hello to them. I know I've spoken to them before, and I just thought it interesting that they're an organisation, a community-led housing group who I spoke to because they were interested in setting up or exploring the idea of a project based along a railway line. And I don't think they're the only organisation who are thinking along those lines of, you know, if you are going to do a community-led housing project, the connectivity of that project is vital, really, is, you know, taking into consideration the transport needs. So yeah, so that was good to see them here, and maybe that helps kind of give a bit of context as to what I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about train services, you'll be pleased to hear. We're the development company are not, we're not the train providers, so that's Transport for Wales, who I'm sure you've all heard of. We're a small charitable organisation where we're a not-for-profit company, and you know, we employ three part-time members of staff, and our role, as Casey said earlier, was to promote the line, to engage with communities, and to really develop rural railway routes in particular as as vital parts of local communities. And it's surprising, I found it very surprising when I joined that how little sometimes trains are considered as part of the local sort of community, business and tourism infrastructure. I think there's a little bit of, to be honest, I think there's an element of taking them for granted. But you know, I caution against that really. I think we can't take any of these things for granted. But I guess some of it is the fact that people don't really know necessarily all of the things that they're involved with. So hopefully I'll be able to enlighten you a bit through the session. So, you know, when you think about rural railways, this is probably what most people think of. They think of a lovely little train trundling through scenic parts of Wales, flowers on the platform, you know, that type of thing. And absolutely that is the case in lots of areas. But I'm going to kind of dispel the myth a little bit and show you a couple of other pictures just to set the tone, just to give a bit of reality check. These are two incidents that have happened on our line recently. So we had a landslide north of Knighton a few months ago, and you can see the devastation that's caused. And that part of the line is still closed, is still being repaired, and will continue to be closed probably until about November. And following that, a few weeks later, was a massive diesel spill and fire at Llangennet near Llanelli. And you know, that's closed the line probably until the new year. It's literally melted the lines. It took 24 hours to put out that fire. And the reason I'm putting those up is I guess to highlight the vulnerability of rural lines as well. You know, like I said earlier, not to be taken for granted, because both of these incidents have cut off people from getting out and about as much as you can at the moment. Lots of people are unable now to move between communities because the line is completely closed now, and will be for some time. And it's going to cost millions of pounds to repair the damage. You know, Network Rail are working hard to do that, and they're very committed to doing it. But if you think about dropping numbers on railways and the revenue that we get in, all of our lines are subsidised, and probably the Heart of Wales more than most, although I don't know that for a fact, but I would imagine so. So I think it's just important to highlight the vulnerability of railways in communities, and like I said, not to take them for granted. But on a happier note, I'm going to now kind of talk about community rail in a bit more detail. Excuse me. So hopefully some of you have heard of community rail as a concept. I must admit I hadn't before I took my job, but this is a screenshot from the website of the Community Rail Network, which is the umbrella organisation for all the community rail partnerships in Britain. And they've put it quite neatly there. We engage communities, help people get the most from their railways. We promote social inclusion, sustainable travel, and we work with the train operators to bring about improvements and bring stations back to life. And this sort of builds on that really. This is the strategy that was put out by the Department for Transport a couple of years ago, called Connecting Communities with Railways. Actually a really good strategy, and I'm not a huge fan of strategies myself, but you know, this was very refreshing. It's a very forward thinking, and it gives a real good strong foundation for community rail, and it kind of places it elevates it. I think community rail's always been around, but I think it's really elevated it and given it a real sort of position and trying to position it much more importantly, I guess, in communities. And it talks about these 4 pillars. So rather than you having to read it, those are the 4 pillars there. That's pretty much what it boils down to, is that community rail partnerships, we provide a voice for the community. So we are that link between the passenger and communities and the transport providers, and to a certain extent Welsh Government here in Wales. We promote sustainable, healthy, accessible travel. We bring communities together, support diversity and inclusion. That's really important, because there are a lot of communities, whether that's communities of place or communities, you know, different types of communities who have barriers to using the train. So it's important that we work on inclusion and make sure nobody's excluded. And a really big one is supporting social and economic development. You know, we're about bringing prosperity to towns, cities and villages, and that's a really sort of key fundamental part of what we do. You know, I should name check both of these things. That Transport for Wales is the provider. For those of you who don't know, Transport for Wales is a sort of arm's length bit of Welsh Government, so it's a wholly owned subsidiary. And this is a whole new model. It's not the model that exists in the rest of Britain, but and it's developing this a lot of work around transportation across Wales. And it started with the trains, but it's also now branching out into bus services as well. And it franchises the train service to another organisation, but it actually retains a lot of services itself. So, for example, it delivers catering, it actually delivers community rail and all sorts of other elements. And they fund all the community rail partnerships in Wales. And the reason I put the image of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act at the bottom, the Sustainable Development Principles, is because that does guide a lot of what Transport for Wales do. So they're not just about, you know, it's not a private company just thinking, oh, well, we just need to run trains and make a profit and all the rest of it. They are very interested in sustainability, very interested in communities and sort of delivering against the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and other Welsh Government priorities. So it's sort of interesting. It's still early days, and there's a lot of politics and a lot of change and a lot of recruitment and development still going on. But I'm hopeful that in the future we'll start to see some really good stuff coming out from them. This is just a quick map to show you where all the community rail partnerships are across Wales. So if obviously you're not all in our area, you can see the Heart of Wales there across the middle, but there are partnerships all across Wales. The ones in grey are the ones that exist already. So up in the north, Conwy Valley, the Cambrian Line, the Chester-Shrewsbury Line and the Borderlands. There's also the ones that are in colour are the ones that are under development. So these were all the commitments made by Transport for Wales to developing new community rail partnerships when they took over the franchise. And those, so there are a couple of those that have now turned grey that now do exist. So the Swansea and West Community Rail Partnership has now been set up and is called South West Wales Connected. And I believe Jen is somewhere in the audience. She's the new, my equivalent down there in sort of Pembrokeshire, sort of west of our line really. And the North Wales coast also, that's now been absorbed into the Conwy Valley CRP. So, but all of those others are still under development. But hopefully there's, you know, if you're interested in working with a CRP, a community rail partnership, then you'll be able to contact one, and I'm happy to provide details of the people you might want to contact if you're interested in those other areas. So I'm going to talk about the Heart of Wales line a little bit and what we do as a community rail partnership. Not just because I want to talk about us, but also because I'd like that to be an example, examples of what you might find other CRPs doing across Wales as well. So it's a line that it's 121 miles. There's it runs from Swansea in the south up to Shrewsbury in the north. That's a very typical image. That's Kinhordy Viaduct in Carmarthenshire, and the train is a very typical image. You know, as I said earlier, single carriage, trundling along, scenic views. You know, really beautiful line. And I put this up mainly because I was just so pleased that John Harris, who's a Guardian journalist, he wrote about the line last year, and for once, you know, wasn't just talking about tourism. He recognised, because he did the walking trail, which I'll talk about in a while, but he recognised those arrows are mine, by the way, not his, but just pointing out the Heart of Wales line offers much more than a beautiful scenery. It shows social rail can transform communities, and that was sort of music to my ears, really, to see a journalist picking up on that opportunity of what community rail partnerships can do. So yeah, that's just something I was pretty happy about. I thought I'd show a station building because, you know, housing people like buildings, and there's a beautiful building. But yeah, then this is Llandrindod Wells, lovely station building, not used as a station. In fact, none of our stations are actually used as stations anymore, apart from Swansea, I guess, and Shrewsbury up in the north. But all the station buildings in between are either, well, one's a ticket office, but it's not really run by Transport for Wales. But this is a really good example of, this is Llanertid Wales in Powys. It's a building that's used for community benefits. So it's occupied by a community transport group, and they run all sorts of events there, and it's being put to really good use. And Transport for Wales are really interested. They've got a massive programme at the moment of improving station buildings, because, you know, we've all seen the sort of shabby station buildings. They look very quaint, but they're, you know, take a lot of money to maintain, etc. So they're investing in refurbishing buildings and working with communities to reinstate these valuable assets. And, you know, why not housing? You know, I was thinking about that, and I'm not sure that I've seen it done, but, you know, there's opportunities there. Transport for Wales have got they're very open-minded in terms of who they work with. And, you know, if a housing organisation wanted to talk about bringing a station back to life, I'm sure they'd be up for that conversation. The next one, this is Llandovery. This is sort of one of the jewels in our crown, really. It's a beautiful Grade 2 listed station building in Llandovery in Carmarthenshire. We took it over 12 years ago, had it refurbished, and it was opened as a cafe run by volunteers from the local community to serve and benefit local people. The image on the left is some craft done by local charitable organisations. So it really has been an amazing resource for the community, but unfortunately hit by COVID, closed in March, and probably won't reopen, unfortunately, because it wasn't ultimately not a sustainable model, being run by volunteers, not with all of the health and safety restrictions that now have to be put in place. So it's currently closed, and we're looking at new solutions and new opportunities to reopen it in the spring, but using a different social enterprise model. But a really valuable asset to the local community. Of course, you know, we see the lovely gardens, and the gardens, you know, we're talking, you know, great for biodiversity here. But behind the scenes, you know, we've got, well, across Wales, probably hundreds of volunteers maintaining stations, looking after gardens. Those are called station adopters. There's Mary and Joan down at the bottom, you know, who've ran that cafe pretty much, not single-handedly, but with a small group of volunteers for the last 12 years. And we've got volunteers, trail champions, who are out looking after and maintaining our walking trails. So massive network of brilliant people supporting their railways. We've done, you know, lots of work with children and schools. This is at Bilth Road. That's my electric bike that I've used to get around. Bilth Road is about 2 or 3 miles from Bilth Wells, and quite an isolated, small sort of former railway community. And we did some work with them to, we got some funding from Transport for Wales to help them develop a series of routes and maps and walks around the local area for the local community who weren't really aware about local footpaths and rights of way. So they've developed that now, but that will really benefit passengers as well who want to walk from the station to Bilth Road. This shows them how to do it. So it's a lovely community-led project. All of the projects that we work on is with communities. We haven't got the capacity to deliver much ourselves. So it's key that we do engage with community groups to help us with delivery, and that work seems to work really well. This is a community resilience fund that we set up during COVID. We weren't able to get out and about, unfortunately, so we used our resources, and that was match funded by Transport for Wales. So we created a resilience fund of £10,000, which has just been distributed to small, vulnerable community groups along the line. We worked with the local CVCs to identify groups. They all bid for small pots of money, and we were massively oversubscribed. So it just goes to show, you know, that there's a lot of vulnerable groups out there who are at risk at the moment. So we felt this was a really good way for us to do something with our resources to help them. And the way that we engage, this is something I started last year, and that carried on up until March, until COVID stopped the show. But we go up and down the line, basically engaging and having conversations with communities and just talking to them about, not just about what we do, but mainly about what's going on for them, and finding out about that community and seeing which ways, trying to inspire them really to think about the railway as an opportunity and an asset in the area, to, you know, something that they can connect with. Because one thing we have got is access to some funding through Transport for Wales, but also other Department for Transport, etc. So it's a nice hook. So lastly, I've got a few slides here, and I'd just like to talk about the trail in a bit more detail, because the trail, the Heart of Wales Line Trail, if you're not familiar with it, is a 140-mile trail that runs all the way along. It was devised a few years ago by walkers and train people in a pub, I think is where it all started, is my understanding anyway. The things that sort of marriage made in heaven, really. They got talking about, you know, could there be a trail that connected all of the stations and meant that people didn't have to use their cars to go on a walking trail. And this is it, really. They devised it. It took about 2 years and a lot of hard work. It was led by a guy called Les Lumsden, who's a real expert in walking trails and public transport. And yeah, they did it. It was they did a feasibility study, worked very hard, and came up with this trail that was launched in 3 stages. The final stage at the south end was, the middle section was launched last March. And it's just been incredible how popular it's been, because it is a brilliantly executed trail. And I think people really understand the concept of a slow walking trail. The idea is that people, you know, there's lots of ways you can do it. There's a chap doing it at the moment he's just finished doing it, actually. He's walked from top to bottom without use of any, so he didn't need to use the train because he stayed somewhere overnight every night. And he's documented it all on YouTube, as lots of walkers do. Or, you know, you can do it using the train. You can get the train to one destination and then walk back. You know, there's lots of different ways. We've even had ultra runners do it in over 3 days, but that's the crazy people. The real concept behind the trail is that people take their time. It's about the slow movement, really. It's a slow train and it's a slow trail. And the idea is that you take it all in, and you stop in local communities. You go to the pub, or you go to you use local accommodation, and you shop in local shops. And that's what's proving really popular. And every time we talk to people, businesses in some of the small, tiny towns, they all say that they have benefited from the trail and that people have started to use it. So we've got a huge opportunity to expand on that. We're going to increase, we're going to have an accommodation page on our website so that people can find accommodation via us if they're walking the trail, for example. And we want to start developing smaller walking trails, like circular trails from stations. Lots of CRPs do that, and it's a really good way to bring people into towns, because the walking and cycling community is absolutely huge. So massive opportunities there. And that's something that we're really going to focus on in the future, is this area of health and well-being, social and economic development through walking and cycling, because we think that's playing to our strengths as a line. And there's a book that accompanies it that Les Lumsden wrote, which is a fantastic book. Not quite a #1 bestseller, but it should be. It's a great book. And I'll just finish really now. I think that's enough of trains and walks, but I've got these beautiful photos just to inspire you. If anybody's interested in walking the trail, I can give you more details. But you can see, you know, like I say, every time when the trains were running, all we saw were backpackers, you know, people getting on and off and using it for that purpose. It will shortly be, hopefully, on an OS map. So we're working hard to meet the criteria to get it onto Ordnance Survey. But yeah, that's Nuckless in the north, another beautiful viaduct. I hope that it makes more sense why I'm here now. I hope, you know, there's kind of that understanding of how potentially housing groups or other groups could tap into community rail partnerships and see them as a potential partner. You know, it's also just, you know, don't forget, if you have got a railway running through your area, you know, just connect with them and make sure you use the trains. You know, I don't think it's a case of use it or lose it, but I do think, you know, we need to make sure that future generations do see the rail network as something that is about the future. I mean, I've painted quite a sort of a rustic image of our line because that's our selling point, but I think in the future, you know, who knows? I saw in the news today that they launched their first, the first hydrogen train did its first journey today. The Heart of Wales line is never going to be electrified. So, you know, maybe in the future we'll be one of the first hydrogen powered lines. You never know. These things need thinking about, talking about. I hope that's been useful. I look forward to some of your questions at the end. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Lisa. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, I think, you know, the transport elements for any rural communities are really important to ensure their sustainability and resilience for the future. And I think it links in really nicely with Sarah's little web as well of, you know, all the facilities and services within a community, which is vital. And really interesting that none of the stations actually use the stations along the line. So definitely some potential community assets there for community groups and maybe housing, like you said. And moving on to sort of talking more about community assets, I'm really pleased to have Sian Williams here from 4CG. And just to give their full name, so it's the Cymdeithas Cynnal a Cefnogi Cefn Gwlad, or the Society to Sustain and Support the Rural Countryside. So 4CG is a cooperative organisation set up to advance community development through the regeneration of Cardigan and the surrounding area. So it was set up by a group of locals that felt strongly that there were many opportunities within Cardigan to increase community cohesion, enhance the surroundings, and to take small steps to improve the local economy, and that a determined and focused organisation could make a difference. So Sian is the director of 4CG and is passionate about local heritage and culture, renewable energy, and local economic stability and security. So to tell us more about 4CG, delighted to have Sian here. Sian, do you want to unmute yourself and hand over to you?
There we are. Yes, good morning, and thank you for inviting me here today. So a little bit more about 4CG then. So what is 4CG? We're a community benefit charity established in 2010. So why did 4CG have to come about? Basically, there were developers developing a site then in Cardigan town itself. 3,000 people signed a petition to say that they didn't want any more supermarkets or the multinational shops coming into Cardigan to strip assets once again from our high street. So even though 3,000 local people had signed this petition, the supermarket got its planning permission and the site was to be developed. On the back of that then, another site in the heart of Cardigan came up for sale, almost 2 acres. So we decided the only way that local people can be sure of what happens in their towns or in their locality is that we own it. Because somehow the planning authorities don't listen to local people. So we launched a scheme and 900 local people came forward, and it was a share offer, and we bought the site in the heart of Cardigan. There were developers from outside Wales after this site again. They wanted to build social housing and flats, but not necessarily for local people. But what we want in our town is work and affordable car parking to support the high street. So that's how it started. Since then, we have on our site in Cardigan town itself, we have an eco shop which recycles everything. We have a children's centre. We have a warehouse that upcycles and recycles furniture. We have one of the best Mexican takeaways in Britain. And that again was a young person wanting to open up her own restaurant and takeaway. So in 4CG, we offer cheap rents for people, especially youngsters, to start off. The leases are short, and if things don't work out, they can give the keys back on Friday, and the lease is finished by Monday. So they're not afraid to venture. So of course we've got the cheap parking in Cardigan. We've helped with the lantern parade, the carnival lights, and of course another project which I'm quite proud of is the local fish processing feasibility study we did a few years ago. Our fishermen sell their catch unprocessed. The bulk of the profit goes to the middleman. So what we've decided here in Cardigan, we're going to process our own fish. We will become that middleman, keeping that money circulating our local economy. So instead of selling raw fish, we're in the process now of selling processed fish directly to the shops, restaurants and consumers. So another project three projects we're working on at the moment. A bunkhouse, we bought the old police station and courthouse. That will become a bunkhouse then to encourage people to stay in Cardigan town itself, walkers, canoeists and so on, therefore supporting the restaurants and pubs in Cardigan town itself. And we're also working on a local energy club where people that have got PV panels on their roofs, one or two people have got small wind turbines. So the generators can sell their electric straight to the consumers instead of going back to the grid and then sold back to local people. So therefore, the generators get more for the electric and the consumers get it back cheaper. Once again, keeping that money circulating in our local economy. And of course, our next big project will be a local produce supermarket. In Wales, we have got the best farmers and growers, in my opinion, in the world. It's ridiculous that farmers and growers are paid a pittance for their produce. And it is bought back and sold back to us in the supermarket for far more than the farmers and growers ever had for it. These supermarkets are making too much money on the back of the producers and the farmers of Wales. We have been working with Sheffield University on the true value of the local pound. As Sarah was saying, there is a network or a web of support. If a pound spent on something grown or produced locally, that can be worth £7 to the local economy. As Sarah was saying, the baker could go to the butcher goes to the restaurant will go to the pub, the man from the pub will fill up in the local garage. So that pound is circulated within the local economy. If you go to one of the big supermarkets, that pound is worth less than a penny to the local economy. And that's if all the staff spend all their money locally. When you go to the multinational companies, that pound is whisked out of the local economy, never to return. So this is what we're working on, to strengthen the foundations of our local economy. And through that, jobs are created for our children. They don't have to move away to look for work. I mean, Wales doesn't need to be this poor. Pound for pound, Wales is the biggest energy producer in the world for such a small company. We export energy, we export billions of pounds worth of water every year, and we export food. We are still poor because we do not have the power to gain the benefit of this revenue, and that is scandalous. Anyway, I won't go on about that. So this is what we do, and this is why we do it. I'd like to say a little bit then about the devastation second homes and holiday homes are having on our rural countryside. Of course, as Sarah was saying, young people haven't got the jobs because money's leaving our local economy far too quickly without circulating and creating jobs. Even those that do work in rural areas of Wales, they can't afford to buy their own homes anymore because of people from outside the area, where they earn far more than anybody in Wales will ever earn, can easily come to Wales, buy a second home for a fraction of their income. So, I mean, Newport, Pembrokeshire, 50% of the homes in Newport are second homes. I mean, the balance, it's beyond, you know, the balance is tipped too far, in my opinion. Holiday homes as such, owned by local people, I can't see that they're not as detrimental to rural West Wales as the second homes. If a local family has renovated an old barn or an old cottage they had on their farm, and that is let for most of the year, that brings money into the local economy. The second homes that are used for weeks a year are crippling our countryside. And quite often they have their deliveries bought in, and they support very little of rural Wales. So of course you also have people then retiring from outside Wales and moving to usually the coast to buy their retirement homes. But of course, these people that are moving into Wales when they are getting to the end of their lives, and where they will be most dependent on healthcare, where they have paid national insurance in another country, they are challenging the local health authority above and beyond what is capable of delivering. So the Health Board in Wales has to take the pressure of people moving into rural West Wales to retire as well, where they haven't paid the national insurance in. So that is another problem we're facing by people. Wales is a beautiful country. I don't blame them for coming to live here, but the balance, we can't carry what's happening now. The balance is tipping. Local housing in Wales, in my area, Cardigan, Ceredigion, we used to have, up to last year, Ceredigion Care Society. Tai Ceredigion, Tai Cartref, Mid Wales Housing. All of these have been swallowed up by West Wales Housing, based in Cardiff and Deeside. local people and local needs don't come into the equation anymore. 4CG are in the process of setting up a community land trust. There is a need for housing for local people in rural Wales. And the local planning departments, I feel they live in a world of their own. You know, the devastation that is happening to the Welsh language and the way of life, it's criminal, and perhaps it'll never come back to the way it was. You know, we educate our children, we educate them in Welsh to send them away to find jobs. That is devastating the Welsh way of life. That people move to Wales because they like what Wales is and the way it is. But because of this influx, we're losing the Welsh way of life. Now then, so as I said, we're trying to set up a community land trust. We're working with local young farmers to set this up, and we're going to work with farmers in the area as well. So hopefully, instead of buying land from them, we give them plots, and plots will be given to the local community land trust, that's us, to be given to local people that we need to support the holiday homes, the care homes in West Wales as it is. Because if we lose any more youngsters from rural West Wales anyway, we won't have the youngsters to work in the sectors that are being created by the influx of people to this area. Thank you.
Well, you're doing some really great work in Cardigan, and we had a session on why towns matter yesterday, and definitely ringing some bells in some of the discussions that we were having. And I think every town in a community could do with an organisation like yourselves who are supporting local people and supporting the voices of local people to being heard as well. So thanks for sharing the work that you're doing with us today. So that's the end of the speakers and the presentation. So I'd like to open it up to some questions and discussions now. I've seen lots of comments in the chat as we've been going on. So I'll have a quick look through there now to see if there are any questions. But yeah, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, or just pop your hand up, turn your camera on, and I'll try and keep an eye out for everybody. But I can see there's a question coming in from Matt Forshan actually, around how you acquired your properties. Was it via a community asset transfer from the council?
It was via share purchase, and all the money we make on the 4CG sites, we reinvest them back into this project. So by doing that, we were able to secure these properties via mortgage or better share offers to the people of the locality. Because after all is said and done, I mean, if people have retired or they've got savings, they have next to nothing, you know, banks and building societies. In 4CG, if you invest in 4CG, you have up to 4% each month on your investment. So then again, we're keeping that money staying in the locality. Where we went to buy the police station and courthouse, we needed a small mortgage. So we went to Lloyd's TSB, and I think it was 5.25%, the interest rate we'd be paying back to them, plus 3,600 setup fees. We launched a share offer. We asked people if they wanted to invest, with 4% going straight back to them. 4CG was saving then 1.25%, and the people of the locality were getting 4% for their savings and for their investment.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question, Matt. So I can't see any other questions in the chat, but I can see a hand up from Tracy Alexander. Have you got a question, Tracy? If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, right. With the railway stations, I think it was mentioned anyway about having housing mix. So you have a model whereby you can work with local groups on the refurbishment, a bit like St Fagans in effect, coming out into the community instead of self-containing. So engage in the projects around that, but also the buses and shuttles alongside that railway station, which can be rebuilt in traditional style or it can be refurbished, but linking up with the community around, you need the shuttle service to link in with the rail service. So I wondered if Heart of Wales actually doing that in the future, working with Transport for Wales to link up different communities with the railway stations.
I think that's a really important point, Tracy. You know, not every community, you know, lots of people live some distance, especially from some of the rural halts, which are often stuck in the middle of nowhere and you know, difficult to get to. I think, you know, it's something that we're very interested in. A lot of CRPs do a lot of work around integrated transport. This is where we need to work with our local authorities and Transport for Wales, Welsh Government to make this work better. I know Transport for Wales have just launched a new flexibus system, which is more based on sort of bookable seats, and they'll go off their routes and things like that. So they are exploring new models, but it's a massive area. I think it's really patchy. Some areas have really good community transport systems set up and can integrate well. Other areas, it's appalling. You know, the difficulty I have really is that a lot of the conversations I have with Transport for Wales, it's often about numbers, and you know, rural areas just can never compete on numbers. We can't win that argument. We can't say, you know, why are you putting more. For me, it's about impact, and I think that's how we need to think about transport now. Is poor services, or when services get cancelled, for example, what's the impact on the individual? What's the impact on that community? Because if you cancel a train in Cardiff, there might be another one along in 5 or 10 minutes, but on our line you have to wait 4 hours for the next one to come. So you know, I'm having this conversation with them about how we look at impact of poor transport services. I talk about trains, but it's exactly the same for buses. So when buses disappear or aren't integrated, you know, that can have a devastating effect on communities. So it's a really big issue. It is something that we want to look at in the future, but it very much depends on the relationship with local authorities, I think, to work on that.
Can I suggest that with developments that are coming on board, that with the transport strategy, we work towards a permit to drive, pass to travel. So therefore, the dwellings or the people who live in those dwellings, they pay annually for a pass to operate a local shuttle service that integrates into the main routes. On roadless estates, so they're actually they choose to live on a roadless estate, but they can't keep cars, so they're forced by their choice to operate on local shuttles, which they pay for, and integrate into the main routes.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Thanks, Tracy. Lisa, did you want to come in, Sarah? I saw you have your hand up then.
Sorry, I couldn't work out how to put my hand up electronically, so I thought I'll just wave. It's just really interesting as well how that then fits into what I was saying about the planning policy, and that planning policy at the moment is to move people away from rural communities to more sustainable communities where there's more transport, more facilities and so on. But as we're moving to the future, and things like pandemics, challenges because of climate change and so on, and that people will be needing to move back into rural areas, actually the part of that is increasing that local infrastructure, isn't it, such as the train services, the shuttle buses and so on. And what's really great, I think, in as Sian has been showing, in rural areas or when that's built up from within the community, a community can work in a nimble way and sort of come up with innovative solutions that one work for that community but can also work in other communities, and that can be shared across. So in a way, I think, even though planning policy might not have caught up yet, I think communities and people working with communities can sort of prepare for that state of affairs, if you like. So we're sort of ready to roll, as that shift could well take place, as it were.
Yeah, and I think this pandemic has shown as well the sort of the capacity and the capability of communities, and how quickly communities can move and the action that they can take. Whereas, in typical circumstances, there are lots of hoops to jump through and red tape to get through. And I think because this pandemic has shown that in whatever form it's been, whether it's rallying around to, do food shops and things like that, it's the pace that the communities can move without necessarily support from maybe the local authority. And I think maybe planners and local authorities need to recognise that moving forward, definitely. Just seen a question as well from Lydia Powell from Brontleys Wellbeing Park for Lisa. Are you in touch with the Connected Cities organisations, as they are very involved with railway sustainability of communities?
Short answer, no, but I've written it down already. I've spotted that, so that's a really good lead. Thanks, Lydia. Yeah. There are a lot of organisations out there, and I've come into contact with some really good ones, but I think there's a huge amount more work to do, in terms of building our networks and broadening the conversations that we're having sort of beyond railway people. Basically, that's what I'm trying to do at the moment, is think about it much more broadly. Talking to lots of interesting organisations out there. So thanks for that lead, Lydia. That's great.
Can I just come in and say that at Brontleys Wellbeing Park, we're just at the moment working on our transport feasibility study for Arwine, and one of the things that we're looking at is trying to use Brontleys Hospital as a source of lots of off-grid electricity, to try and develop a sort of rechargeable rural transport network, where each of our local communities fundraises for a vehicle, a rechargeable vehicle, and then we develop a network of maybe 3 circular journeys a day, so that people can get to work, can get to the shops, can actually get to hospital appointments at Brontleys and other places, and then people can keep in touch. So that's one area that we're looking at, and we'd also like them to be able to get somehow to a public transport link with the railway, so that people can get to Hereford, can get to Abergavenny, and get to Bilth Wells, which is our nearest, Bilth Road rather, which is our nearest link to Hearts of Wales. But that's kind of what we're trying to do now with our project.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Lydia. Just a really interesting comment as well from Keith Henson as well in the chat, who is also a rural housing enabler covering the Ceredigion area, around sort of the loss of Welsh language and culture as these new developments come into communities where they just don't necessarily think of the local community and are just there to provide housing, really, and whether that housing is even right for the local community is also questionable, I think. So I think that's a really another important point there. So I think we've got time for perhaps one more question or one more comment. So please feel free to turn your camera on or ask in the chat for any of our speakers or for us at the Communities Creating Homes team as well.
I just wondering if any of the participants has had any good experience of using time banking, because that's kind of what we're hoping to use for our volunteer drivers as a way of repaying them for their input. Just a shout out, really.
If anybody's got any experience of time banking, please feel free to jump in, or if you want to drop Lydia a line in the chat, then I'm sure she'd be willing to share her contact details. Sarah, have you got any experience?
Not specifically time banking, but I was on a training course not long ago that was about, well, last week, that was about some of the technological tools that you can use to help increase resilience within communities. And I will, I won't be able to copy and paste it into the chat. I haven't got those technological skills, but I could pass on, if I pass it on to you, Casey, via email, perhaps you could then pass it on to, because there was some really useful sort of tools and websites and apps and stuff that could, and interestingly, the take up with them had been a lot higher in urban areas, obviously. But I was thinking, actually, in some rural communities, they could be handy, you know. So I'll pass that on.
Great, yeah, that's fab. I will make sure that I send that round. So, like I said at the start, we are recording this session, so everyone will get a copy of the recording towards the end of the week, hopefully, and I'll send any links as well, or any presentations that are relevant to today. So I think I'll draw it to a close there. I can see it's nearly 11:30, so I did promise you I'd let you get on with your day at 11:30. So thank you so much for everybody for joining today, and thank you to our speakers, Lisa, Sarah and Sian. Really interesting and important conversation, I think, around regenerating rural communities. Like I said at the start, it's part of our community-led housing festival, the first, hopefully, of many as we move forward. And this year's theme is all about regeneration. So really, really important, I think. And just to plug our final session tomorrow at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, which is all around community-led housing and how the communities and local people can rally together to actually impact decisions made on their own communities. So yes, and just to answer your question, Maggie, I can see in the chat that one will be recorded tomorrow and we'll send it round for anybody that's booked on. But just a final thank you and diolch for attending today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day and hopefully see you soon. Thank you very much. Hwyl, diolch, bye. In the
I put her in the waiting room.
You can do that, can you?
I couldn't remove her. That's really weird.
I think she's having issues anyway with her tech, isn't she? She's
going to be really confused now.
She's going to be like, is there another session?
Is that Maggie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh dear, poor Maggie.
I think she's attended the majority of our networks and things, though, hasn't she? So
she has, yeah. Tried to anyway.
Yeah. Where was she not? I know she said, was it Llanfairfechan in North Wales?
I need to stop recording.
Oh.